The Skeptic and the Spirit. A man who worked on an offshore rig, referred to here as Dave, had experiences that drastically altered his views on the supernatural. Before his time on the rig, Dave was a skeptic, dismissing tales of spirits and hauntings as exaggerated stories. However, his time aboard this particular rig left him questioning everything he thought he knew. The rig itself had a tragic history. Years earlier, a massive fire had engulfed the structure, claiming the lives of many crew members. Among the dead was the rig's captain, remembered as a selfless and heroic figure. In the chaos of the fire, he had rushed into a burning room to save trapped crewmates and ended up losing his life in the process. After the flames were extinguished, the rig's crew faced the grim task of dealing with the dead while waiting for ships to carry the bodies to the mainland. The captain's room was then repurposed as a temporary morgue, and the bodies of the deceased, including the captain himself, were stored there. By the time Dave joined the rig as a fresh hire, it had been rebuilt and was fully operational again. Being new, he was given basic tasks to familiarize himself with the environment. Unbeknownst to him though at the time, the room assigned to him was the very same one used to store the corpses during the tragedy. It was also the late captain's quarters. Initially, this detail seemed irrelevant to Dave, who was unaware of the rig's history. His roommate had yet to arrive, so he spent the first week in the room alone. From the first few nights, Dave experienced some disturbances. Every other night, he would be jolted awake by the sensation of someone violently shaking him and yelling, "There's a fire, there's a fire." The vivid dreams that followed were just as unnerving. He saw the faces of people he didn't recognize, only for their appearance to morph into burned and charred visages. Dave approached his captain later to share what had been happening. It was then that the captain told him about the rig's history, the fire, and the significance of the room Dave was occupying. The captain offered to move him to another room if the disturbances continued. However, the very same day Dave's roommate arrived, and to Dave's relief, the whole incident stopped. Things took an even stranger turn one day while Dave was descending from a crane using a ladder. He ended up missing a step and began to fall. Even though it wasn't a great height, the weight of his equipment could have caused really serious injury or even taken him out of work for months. Just as he was about to hit the platform, he felt someone grab him firmly from behind and push him back onto the ladder. Regaining his grip, he safely descended the rest of the way. When Dave turned to thank the person who had saved him, there was no one there. Confused, he checked the area but found no trace of anyone nearby. Later, in the cafeteria, he asked his colleagues who had been out on the deck with him at the time. They all confirmed that he had been alone. Disturbed by the incident, Dave returned to the captain to explain what had happened again. The captain listened and calmly suggested that it might have been the spirit of the late captain, continuing his mission of protecting the crew and helping others even in death. From that point on, Dave's skepticism about the supernatural was deeply challenged. He couldn't rationalize what he had experienced, but he also couldn't ignore it. To this day, when asked about spirits and hauntings, Dave hesitates. The Ghost of Captain Kidd. So a bit more famous one is the tale of Captain Kidd's ghost. Off the shores of Pelham, New York, treasure hunters have long whispered of encounters with an apparition believed to be William Kidd himself, guarding his lost riches. Though historical accounts verified that Kidd, a notorious 17th century pirate, sailed the waters of Long Island Sound, the idea that his ghost still lingers is rooted in both local lore and some first-hand experiences. The legend suggests that Kidd buried treasure on one of the many islands dotting the waters near Pelham. Over the centuries then, treasure seekers have scoured Huckleberry Island, High Island, and others, hoping to uncover his lost loot. One of these hunters, a weathered old man, reportedly had an encounter that would stop him in his tracks and send him fleeing from one such island forever. The man, known for his relentless pursuit of buried wealth, spent many years hopping from island to island with a tattered shovel in hand. Then, on one fateful evening in the 1870s, as daylight faded and shadows lengthened, he found himself poking among rocks on an unnamed island. His eyes then ended up locking onto two massive boulders that fit together unnaturally, with their seamless alignment suggesting they hid something beneath. With his excitement mounting, he began clearing a pile of stones from one side of the rocks. Underneath, he discovered a large, flat stone that clearly concealed a dark opening. Driven by greed and curiosity, he pried the heavy stone away and peered into the hole. Though it was nearly dark, he climbed down, feeling his way through the blackness. As his eyes finally adjusted, he saw what appeared to be a stack of heavy wooden boxes. When he touched one, he felt its weight and realized the boxes were filled with something solid, perhaps the gold and silver of Captain Kidd's fabled treasure. Before he could celebrate his discovery, a glowing figure appeared, blocking his way out. The old man froze in his tracks as he saw what could only be described as the ghost of Captain Kidd. Dressed in torn 17th century clothing, the apparition floated menacingly, radiating a kind of otherworldly light. The treasure hunter's exhilaration now turned to dread as the ghost circled him. The ghost then raised a spectral saber, slashing at the air between them, and the old man seized his chance to escape. He scrambled out of the hole, abandoning his shovel and running for his life toward his rowboat. As he pushed off from the shore, he glanced back to see the luminous figure still standing at the water's edge, pointing its saber as if warning him never to return. But the next day, it was as if nothing had happened. The stones the old man had moved were now back in place and the site appeared undisturbed. His shattered shovel was the only reminder of his encounter. Locals now say that anyone who ventures too close to the hidden treasure risks the wrath of Kidd's ghost, which continues to guard the riches, ensuring they remained untouched. Larry, a man who spent his days working on a cargo ship traversing the Great Lakes, recounted an experience that left him wondering whether unseen forces might be looking out for the crew. Each time the ship left a river or seaway, it was routine for the crew to walk across the deck, regardless of the weather, and secure the anchors. It was a sort of straightforward task, usually uneventful. But on one clear night, something happened that he couldn't quite explain. While walking along the starboard deck to complete his duties, he found himself gazing up at the stars, momentarily caught in thought. As he moved forward, he suddenly heard a voice from his left call out, "Hey!" Instinctively, he stopped and turned to look, but no one was there. Shrugging it off as a strange coincidence, he prepared to move forward again. That's when he noticed that just a step ahead of him, one of the diamond-plated covers for the ship's cables and pipes. If he hadn't stopped, he would have tripped and fallen hard onto the steel deck, something he had seen happen to others in the past. At first, he dismissed the incident as pure chance, but over time, other unusual things began to happen. On quiet nights, he could hear footsteps on the deck when no one was around. Sometimes even he thought he heard his name being called, only to find himself alone. These occurrences became so frequent that he couldn't ignore them, yet he convinced himself it was nothing more than his mind playing tricks after long hours on the ship. As the season then ended, he left the ship for the winter. When spring finally rolled around and it was time to return, he overheard some of the winter work welders talking about someone named Larry. They spoke of him as though he were a larger-than-life character, cheerful but also mischievous. Curious, the man asked about Larry, assuming he might be a long-time crew member he hadn't met yet. The truth, however, was far stranger. Larry, as it turned out, was a seafarer who had passed away years earlier. Yet, according to the welders, his presence on the ship still persisted. Some had seen a figure out of the corner of their eye, but thought little of it, while others reported they'd heard strange sounds, like footsteps or faint voices. Tools would also occasionally go missing, only to turn up later in odd places. These tales didn't seem to frighten the crew, but instead they regarded Larry's antics as a quirk of life aboard the ship. The man couldn't help but think back to the night he had heard the voice, stopping him just in time to avoid a nasty fall. The more he thought about it, the more he began to believe that Larry might still be keeping watch over the crew. Whether it was the lingering spirit of the old seafarer or simply the product of long stretches aboard a massive freighter, he found comfort in the idea. "Thanks, Larry, old buddy. Saved me from some busted chins, maybe even a few teeth. I owe you one," he recounted. The Kappa Encounter. On the night of August 1st, 1984, Ryo Shirozaki, a squid fisherman in Tsushima, Nagasaki Prefecture, was heading home after a late evening at work. It was close to 11 p.m. when he passed near the Kuta River, which is a quiet spot he knew well. As he walked, he noticed a group of figures standing at the water's edge, appearing to be children playing near the river. While it wasn't unusual to see people fishing there at night, the sight of children out at that hour struck him as odd. As Shirozaki got closer, he realized there was something off about these figures. In the moonlight, their faces looked dark and unusual, with their arms and legs unnaturally thin. Their skin had a strange glistening quality that caught the light in a way he couldn't really explain. Troubled by what he was seeing, Shirozaki called out to them, but instead of answering, the figures quickly scattered, vanishing into the water with surprising speed. The next morning, Shirozaki decided to return to the area to see if he could make sense of what he had witnessed. What he found only deepened the mystery though. On the pavement near the water, there was a trail of strange footprints, slimy and shaped like teardrops. The prints were about 22 centimeters long and 12 centimeters wide, spaced roughly 50 to 60 centimeters apart, and stretched for about 20 meters. The substance they were made of had a gelatinous texture and was beginning to harden under the sun. Word then quickly spread among the locals, and speculation grew that the footprints belonged to a kappa, which is a creature from Japanese folklore often associated with rivers and mischief. Shirozaki and others who saw the prints were both fascinated and pretty uneasy about the whole idea. The story even gained enough attention that reportedly police forensic investigators came to examine the scene. They collected samples of the gelatinous substance and sent them to a laboratory for analysis. According to accounts, the investigators determined the material was an unknown secretion. However, the sample was apparently too small to yield any conclusive results, and the investigation was eventually abandoned. Florida Man meets Florida Mermaid. In 1988, professional scuba diver Robert Foster had an experience off the coast of Florida that he would never forget. While exploring underwater formations during a routine dive, he became aware of a sudden disturbance in the water around him. The once calm sea grew turbulent without warning, as if some unseen force had taken hold. The violent churning stirred up sediment from the seafloor, clouding his surroundings and creating an atmosphere of unease. Then, amid the chaos, Foster noticed something moving toward him. As it then drew closer, the figure began to take shape, and its features became more and more apparent. The creature swam with a fluid, undulating motion, and within 20 yards of his position, Foster could see its form in detail. Its upper body bore an uncanny resemblance to a human female with smooth, pale skin and flowing hair. However, this was no ordinary figure. The being's limbs ended in sharp talon-like appendages, and its lower half was covered in scales resembling the tail of a fish. What creeped out Foster the most, though, was its eyes, which seemed to burn with an intensity he described as pure hate, which was a kind of malice he had never encountered in either humans or animals. The creature's movements were deliberate as it approached, with its clawed hands reaching out toward him. And despite his years of experience underwater, Foster found himself overwhelmed with fear. He later recounted that the sheer malevolence radiating from the being was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Realizing the potential danger, Foster didn't wait to see what it might do. With adrenaline surging, he swam back to the surface as quickly as possible, frantically clambering onto his boat. But yeah, he remained unscathed physically, but the encounter left him pretty shaken to his core. and although Foster never saw the creature again, the memory still lingered. He would later describe it as a far cry from the romanticized image of mermaids, labeling it as something otherworldly and hostile. For him, it was a stark reminder of how little is truly known about the depths of the ocean and the creatures that might inhabit it. The experience was then documented in Great Southern Mysteries by E. Randall Floyd, which all added to another chapter to the lore of mysterious encounters in the waters off Florida coast. The Legend of Lake Tarawera. The tale of the Phantom War Canoe on Lake Tarawera, first seen on May 31, 1886, remains one of New Zealand's most enduring and mysterious legends. Witnesses reported seeing a ghostly canoe silently gliding across the lake, shadowed by the imposing Mount Tarawera. The sight was hauntingly vivid. The craft was said to carry 2 rows of spectral figures, one paddling, the other standing solemnly, with their flax robes draped around them and their heads adorned with the sacred plumes of huia and white heron feathers, symbols of death in Maori tradition. To the Maori villagers near Lake Tarawera, the appearance of the canoe was not merely a creepy sight, but a sign. They believed it to be an unmistakable omen foretelling catastrophe, which was a message from the spirits warning of the mountain's wrath. And earlier that morning, the lake's waters had suddenly surged and receded into a mysterious and unnatural event, which further amplified the villagers' fears. These occurrences were linked to deep-rooted local lore surrounding Tamohoi, which was a cannibal chief imprisoned beneath Mount Tarawera centuries earlier by the high priest Nagatoro Irangi. Many believed that the spirit of Tamohoi, stirred by old grievances, might seek vengeance against the living. The gravity of this omen became painfully clear just 11 days later. It was on June 10, 1886, that Mount Tarawera erupted violently. Earthquakes, ash clouds, and pyroclastic flows obliterated nearby villages and even destroyed the famed pink and white terraces once considered natural wonders of the world. Over 100 lives were lost in the devastation. In hindsight, the Phantom Canoes seemed to embody a final warning from the spiritual realm. And also, the legend of the Phantom Canoe was given weight not only by Maori witnesses, but also by European tourists who were in the area that morning. Among them was Mrs. R. Seiss, visiting from Dunedin, who documented her experience in a letter to her son. She described seeing the large canoe from a distance, with its paddlers clearly illuminated as they moved through the mist and sunlight. Her group, which included several notable figures such as Guide Sophia and a priest, Father Kelleher, initially dismissed the sight as unremarkable until later learning from locals that no such canoe existed on the lake. Sophia herself, a revered Maori guide, is said to have noted ominously that she might never see the pink and white terraces again, seemingly sensing the disaster that was about to unfold. Another group of tourists as well also reported seeing the ghostly canoe that day, and one of the passengers, Josiah Martin, even attempted to sketch the strange vessel. Unfortunately, the drawing's whereabouts remain unknown. While some skeptics dismissed the story as a myth, the corroboration from various witnesses, including Europeans unfamiliar with local Maori beliefs, lends it an air of credibility. The incident also became deeply mixed with the Maori understanding of the natural world and the spiritual forces that they believed governed it. The spectral canoe, whether seen as an apparition or an omen, left a great mark on the cultural memory of the region. The Palatine Light. The story of the ghost ship Palatine begins with a tragic voyage in 1738, eventually giving rise to haunting tales that still linger on Block Island. The ship, also known as the Countess Augusta, carried over 200 immigrants from Germany who were seeking a better life in America. Their journey was marked by disaster from the outset. Contaminated water led to disease, storms pushed them off course, and food supplies became dangerously low. After the captain's death, the first mate took over, reportedly charging the desperate passengers for what little food remained. In late December, the ship ran aground at Sandy Point on Block Island during a snowstorm. What followed remains a point of debate. Some accounts claim the islanders brought the survivors ashore, cared for them, and buried the dead. Others accuse them of far darker actions, suggesting they lured the ship onto the shoals with false lights, looted its cargo, and killed the remaining passengers. According to one version, the islanders set the ship on fire and sent it drifting back to sea to destroy all the evidence. One of the passengers, Mary Vanderline, is said to have refused to leave the ship, clinging to her possessions as the flames consumed it. The Palatine is not just remembered for the tragedy of its wreck though. Many who live on or visit Block Island have reported sightings of a strange light near the site of the disaster. This phenomenon, which is often described as a glowing fire-like light, has become known as the Palatine Light. Early written accounts of the light date all the way back to the early 1800s, with witnesses describing it as moving along the horizon like a blazing ship. Some believe the light is connected to the events surrounding the wreck, perhaps as a manifestation of restless spirits or a sign of something left unresolved. Others have tried to find natural explanations, but none have been confirmed. The story was also widely spread in the 19th century after poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote The Wreck of the Palatine. While his poem helped keep the tale alive, it upset many on Block Island who felt it unfairly portrayed their ancestors. Then, over the years, the ghostly reputation of the Palatine grew, blending historical facts with folklore. Modern research has uncovered more details about the passengers who were aboard the ship. Among them were families fleeing difficult lives in Germany, hoping for better opportunities in America. Their journey was one of desperation, worsened by the terrible conditions on the ship. Some of the survivors reportedly chose to remain on Block Island after the wreck, becoming part of its history. The remains of those who didn't survive, though, were buried there, though the fate of the ship itself is sorta unclear. Some say it was scuttled, while others believe it was repaired and then sailed on. Even now, though, visitors to Block Island claim to see the mysterious light or hear the faint cries of Mary Vanderline near the shore. For locals, the tale is a reminder of the island's past, a mix of tragedy and mystery that refuses to fade completely. Hairless Pale Humanoid. In 2012, a couple living in Monterey, California, encountered something at a secluded beach that left them really freaked out. The man, a linguist stationed at DLI, often visited this hidden spot with his wife. Nestled just before the entrance to Big Sur, the beach was accessible only via discreet pull-off from the road, followed by a short hike down a game trail through trees and bushes. Its secluded location ensured it was rarely crowded, with no more than a few visitors at any given time. And as their time in Monterey was coming to an end, the couple decided to make one last visit to the beach for a late-night outing. Unlike their previous trips during daylight or at sunset, this visit was planned for midnight. They arrived, set up a blanket, and enjoyed a picnic under the moonlit sky. The gentle sound of waves and the absence of other visitors created a serene atmosphere. While relaxing on the blanket, they noticed something splashing in the water, about 50 feet from the shore. Initially intrigued, the man assumed it might be a shark, dolphin, or perhaps a whale. Hoping for a closer look, he approached the shoreline. The creature moved parallel to the shore, maintaining its distance, and he followed its path until it reached a section where a rocky outcropping blocked his way. The wet, uneven rocks and the darkness made it too risky to climb, so he stopped to observe from where he stood. The creature continued swimming before emerging from the water on the other side of the rocks. At first, he thought it might be a seal or some other marine animal. However, as it rose onto two legs, its shape and movement defied any easy explanation. The figure, standing between 5 and 6 feet tall, was hairless and pale to the point of appearing to glow faintly under the moonlight. It also lacked any discernible features, being no clothing, no genitals, and no clear identifying marks. The most disturbing aspect was its movement. It stumbled and shambled awkwardly along the shore as though walking on land was unfamiliar to it. After a short time, it turned and disappeared into the bushes and trees separating the beach from the road. The sight left the man disturbed, and while it could have been a person, several details made this unlikely. He then ended up returning to his wife at the blanket, visibly shaken, and relayed what he had seen. They quickly decided to pack up and leave the beach, and though he intended to return the next day to search for tracks or other signs, the couple's preparations for their upcoming move left them short on time. By the time they were free, the sun was already setting and the opportunity had passed. When he finally returned to the beach the following day, any potential evidence, being tracks, disturbed sand, or other clues, was long gone. The fire ship of the Baie de Chaleurs. The Baie de Chaleurs, located along the border of New Brunswick and Quebec, has been the setting for a tale that has interested and mystified for centuries, being the fire ship. Local legend describes a burning vessel that can be seen drifting in the bay with its flames glowing in the darkness. This ghostly ship is said to appear suddenly with its fiery outline haunting those who witness it and then disappearing just as abruptly. The story has persisted for generations, evolving with time but rooted in the mysterious light seen over the water. And one version of the legend ties the phenomenon to Gaspar Corte-Real, who was a Portuguese explorer who arrived in Atlantic Canada during the early 1500s. After a failed attempt to locate the Northwest Passage and disillusioned by his findings, Corte-Real allegedly abducted dozens of indigenous people to sell as slaves. The story goes that he was pursued by those seeking revenge, leading to a fierce battle in which his ship was set ablaze. According to this version, the fiery apparition is the eternal reminder of that doomed vessel. Then, in 1905, historian and naturalist William F. Ganong decided to investigate the phenomenon firsthand. Though initially skeptical, he traveled to the North Shore to gather accounts from local residents. Many claimed to have seen the light over the bay, describing it in vivid detail. Some spoke of a column of fire rising from the water, while others saw a glowing half-moon shape that flickered and moved. Despite variations in these stories though, one detail remained consistent, being that the appearance of the light was often followed by a storm. Ganong concluded that the light had a natural explanation, theorizing it was likely a rare and dramatic instance of St. Elmo's fire. This electrical phenomenon, resembling bright glowing sparks, usually appears during storms or in highly charged atmospheres. However, even with this explanation, Ganong admitted to lingering doubts. His research revealed no comparable examples of St. Elmo's fire being mistaken for a burning ship elsewhere in the world, leaving him uncertain if his findings fully explained what locals had observed. Apparition on Water. In November 2011, a young boy of 10 who goes by Neander Thunder had an unusual encounter while visiting his grandparents' rural home in Myanmar, Bangladesh. The house, a simple tin shed structure, sat about 100 meters away from a main road, connected by an earthen path that wound around a deep pond and through a dense bamboo thicket. It was a quiet and familiar setting, but that evening something extraordinary happened. The boy had accompanied his father to the nearby bazaar to buy groceries. As they returned, his father handed him the groceries and asked him to bring some money back, intending to join friends for a gambling session. On his way back to the house, as he passed the pond, he heard an odd splash. It wasn't a typical splash, but it was soft, drawn out, and strangely deliberate. Curious, he stopped to investigate. The dim light from the half-moon did little to illuminate the pond, especially under the shadow of the bamboo grove. Straining to see through the dark, rippling water, he eventually dismissed the noise as an animal and continued home. Later that night though, after delivering the money to his father and spending some time with him and his friends, the boy started the journey back to his grandparents' house. The night had deepened and the shadows stretched longer under the lowered moon. Focusing intently on the uneven path, he barely noticed the pond until he heard something again. This time it wasn't a splash, but the distinct sound of someone stepping on water. He looked again toward the source and froze. A figure sat cross-legged above the pond's surface as though defying gravity. The woman's skin was pearl white, faintly glowing with a light that didn't seem to come from the moon. Her hair was impossibly dark, darker than the shadows cast by the bamboo. It floated around her head, suspended as if in water. She appeared weightless, with her form slightly bobbing up and down as though in rhythm with the water beneath her. Her eyes, matching the pallor of her skin, fixed directly on him, expressionless yet unnervingly aware. Terrified, he bolted. Despite the darkness and uneven terrain though, he managed to reach his grandparents' house without stumbling, with tears streaming down his face. When asked what had frightened him so badly, he chose to claim he had seen a snake. The idea of admitting a vision of a ghostly nude woman seemed too embarrassing for a 10-year-old, but even his explanation of a snake drew laughter from his family. His father, who returned home around midnight, reported seeing nothing unusual. Years later, after his grandfather's death in 2020, the boy's grandmother decided to have the pond drained and filled in. During the process, the workers discovered an old lock tied with strands of hair near the spot where the boy had seen the woman. Whether this object held any significance remains unclear, but its discovery did add a creepy layer to an already creepy story. The running water mystery. In 1996, a couple visiting Riddle, Essex, experienced a puzzling and still unexplained series of events during their stay at a centuries-old farmhouse turned bed and breakfast. The trip was meant to celebrate the wedding of their eldest daughter, but what they encountered left them with more questions than answers. Upon arrival, the wife and husband were greeted by the property's owner, who led them to their room on the top floor via an old creaking staircase. The husband, struck by the building's age and ambiance, made an offhand comment about how the place seemed perfect for ghostly occurrences. At the time, it was simply a joke, but the events that followed made the remark seem strangely prescient. The first night passed uneventfully until just before dawn, when the wife woke abruptly. She described being disturbed by a bright light shining darkly in her face, so vivid that she assumed her husband had turned on the room's light. When she asked him why he had done so, he groggily denied it, insisting he hadn't touched the light or noticed anything unusual. The couple eventually drifted back to sleep, but the strange experience lingered in their minds. At breakfast, the wife mentioned the incident to the property owner, who surprised them with an unexpected revelation. A previous guest who had stayed in the same room had described an identical experience of a dazzling light waking them in the early hours. This unexpected validation intrigued the couple, but didn't immediately unsettle them. It was the second night that deepened the mystery. As they slept, the wife slowly became aware of an unusual sound. At first, it was faint, but it grew louder until it resembled the gushing of water, like a waterfall coming from a corner of the room nearest her husband. Convinced that the sound was real and concerned her husband might be getting drenched, she woke him. Startled, the husband realized he too had subconsciously registered the noise, but hadn't fully processed it until that moment. Both of them then sat up, straining to locate the source of the rushing water, but the room had no taps or plumbing that could explain the sound. Then, the next morning, they hesitantly recounted their experience during breakfast, unsure of how it would be received. To their astonishment, another guest, staying in the room directly below theirs, chimed in. He admitted he had also heard what sounded like rushing water during the night, so distinct that he felt compelled to open his window, expecting to find a torrential downpour outside. Yet, when he looked, everything was dry, with no rain and no indication of a water source nearby. Seeking answers, the couple questioned the owner, who confirmed that no water pipes ran through that part of the house or the roof above. There was no logical explanation for the sound they had all heard. The odd encounter at sea. A second officer aboard a heavy lifting vessel recounted an incident that occurred during his night shift as the ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. His routine watch from midnight to 4 a.m. typically involved quiet, uneventful hours, occasionally broken by his laps around the bridge console to stay active and alert. However, one particular night, a sequence of events unfolded that he still can't explain. Basically, at around 1:30 a.m., as he walked past the bridge windows, he noticed someone walking along the starboard side of the ship, heading from the aft toward the bow. While crew members were permitted to be on deck at any time, the late hour made the sight somewhat unusual. Initially, he dismissed it as nothing out of the ordinary and just continued his routine. But on his next pass, he saw the figure again. This time, the person was standing motionless between the cargo hold and the windbreaker, facing forward. The officers paused to observe, and the figure suddenly turned to face him. With an unnatural stiffness, the individual raised a hand and began waving, as if signaling directly to him. At first, the officer's unease was kinda mild. However, as he scrutinized the figure, peculiar details began to stand out. The individual wore a white overall, which was inconsistent with the crew's standard red uniforms. Their helmet was also orange, which was a rarity among the ship's usual white helmets. Strangers still, from their position, the person should not have been able to see the officer, as the bridge lights were off and the deck lights created reflections that obscured visibility from below. Yet the figures seemed to track him across the bridge, with their movements deliberate. Reaching for the radio, the officer attempted to communicate, asking for an identification. All he received in return was static. Undeterred, he tried again, but the figure continued to just wave silently. At this point, unease turned into outright concern. Moving to the light console, he activated the bridge spotlights, flooding the deck with bright illumination. When he looked back up, the figure had vanished without a trace. Confused, the officer waited for about half an hour, scanning the deck for any signs of movement. Convinced the person might have hidden in one of the nearby stairways or passageways, he remained vigilant. However, the figure never reappeared, and after an extended period of observation, he turned the lights off and continued his watch. The next morning, the officer questioned the crew, asking if anyone had been on deck during the night. All claimed they had been asleep, and no one admitted to wearing anything other than the standard red overalls. Also, the restricted areas near the setting, including the paint store stairway and bosun store entrance, had been locked the previous evening and remained locked when he checked them after his shift. Despite his efforts to find any logical explanation, nothing added up. The figure's movements, their attire, and their unexplained disappearance upon the floodlights' activation left him pretty freaked out. The possibility of a prank was ruled out after months of asking the crew, as no one admitted to being involved, even when assured there would be no consequences. The Everglades Ghost Boy. So this story is a first-hand account from a user named Jones Blue on the website yourghoststories.com and recounts a really strange experience during a family outing in Florida's Everglades. The day began like any other, with Jones being told of plans for a canoeing trip involving their parents, cousin, and aunt. Though initially uneventful, the trip took a strange turn. The trip ended up taking a really strange turn. The family arrived at the Everglades on a breezy, cold morning. After waiting for their relatives to arrive, they made arrangements to rent canoes. Jones, their cousin, and their aunt then set off in one canoe, while Jones's parents and sister followed shortly after. The group paddled through the serene waters, surrounded by mangrove trees and shallow waters. The calm atmosphere allowed them to enjoy their time together, but an unexpected sight soon disrupted the whole peaceful outing. Jones noticed movement beneath the water and looked closer to see a figure swimming below the surface. The water was shallow, yet the figure moved with ease, stretching its limbs as though unconfined by the tight spaces created by the sandbanks and the mangroves. What startled Jones the most, though, was the figure's appearance, being that it was a young boy around 13 or 14 with blonde hair. His dark eyes, framed by black rings, gave an impression of both sadness and sort of evil. As Jones gasped audibly, drawing the attention of their family, the boy locked eyes with them before disappearing into the depths. When asked what was wrong, Jones brushed off the incident, claiming it was nothing. The group then continued paddling, but the whole presence, of course, still lingered in Jones's mind. Just minutes later, Jones spotted the boy again, this time staring through the thick mangroves with an expression of anger. His eyes now glowed intensely red, making Jones feel as though they had invaded his territory. Uneasy but silent, Jones kept paddling, hoping to avoid further confrontation. As they reached a more open area of the river, the weather suddenly changed. The wind grew stronger and the temperature dropped noticeably. Meanwhile, Jones's cousin stood up to film the scenery with a video camera, with her aunt holding onto her legs for balance. While Jones remained fixated on the boy's angry gaze, the wind intensified, rocking the canoe and causing the cousin to lose her footing. She then fell into the water, snapping Jones's attention back to the present. Panicked, Jones reached out to help their cousin back into the canoe, but couldn't shake the fear of the boy's presence. Glancing back to the spot where they had last seen him, Jones realized he had vanished by now. With urgency, Jones and their aunt managed to pull the cousin out of the water. Though shaken up, she appeared unharmed. Despite the whole incident, the family still continued paddling and eventually returned to shore. It was then on land that the strangeness deepened more. As the group prepared to leave, Jones spotted the boy once more. This time, he stood nearby and gave Jones an ominous wink before disappearing again. Just moments later, the cousin complained of sudden pain in her back. When her shirt was lifted, her back was covered in extensive bruising, black and blue marks that seemed impossible to explain. She claimed not to remember any injury at all, and Jones, while being dismissive, privately connected the bruises to the boy's presence. Years later, Jones revisited the Everglades and shared the story with a local worker. The worker revealed the area's tragic history, recounting the tale of a teenage boy who had drowned there years before. The boy, desperate to win a bet involving holding his breath underwater, had misjudged his limits and died. His impoverished family, devastated by his death, later took their own lives. This backstory added a layer of sorrow to Jones's experience, explaining the boy's lingering presence and the emotions Jones had sensed during their encounter. On leaving the Everglades Center, Jones saw the boy one final time. Standing near the canoes, his expression was no longer angry. His blue eyes held a sadness, but also a hint of understanding, as though acknowledging the connection Jones had made to his story. Jones then waved goodbye, and the boy responded with a faint smile before vanishing. Hypnotized by the Kaaiman Merbeing. On January 10, 2008, in the Surbrock area of South Africa's Western Cape, a group of friends enjoying a casual barbecue along the banks of a river found themselves face to face with a creature straight out of local folklore, being the Kaaiman. These beings, which are described in South African folklore as half-human, half-fish entities with glowing red eyes, are said to be malevolent and capable of hypnotizing or even drowning their victims. For the group that day, the folklore became something much more tangible. Daniel, a local resident, was among those relaxing by the river when an eerie, repetitive sound broke through the evening calm. Describing it as similar to someone bashing on a wall, Daniel felt compelled to investigate. Moving toward the low water bridge, he spotted what appeared to be a woman in the water. She had long black hair and pale skin, and she seemed to be struggling in the current. At first, his instincts told him to help her, but as he came closer, he caught sight of her eyes, which were glowing red in the fading light. A chill ran down his spine, and though fear gripped him, he found himself unable to look away, as if he were caught in a trance. Daniel then called out for help, snapping out of his strange compulsion when his 13-year-old son Dadrian and his 11-year-old nephew Werner approached. As they arrived, he shouted for the rest of the group to come see the figure in the water. Another witness, Martin, described seeing the being swim rapidly from one side of the bridge to the other. At one point, it even climbed onto the bridge itself before diving back to the dark water below. According to Martin, the creature made a haunting sound that resembled a woman crying, with its sorrowful tone echoing eerily across the water. Dina, which is Daniel's mother, was so moved by the sound that she described it as being almost unbearable to hear, saying, "My heart could not take it no more." Her husband, Martinus, added that stories of the Kaaiman had been passed down by their parents, but until that fateful night, they had dismissed them as mere superstition. The encounter left the whole group shaken, with some believing the Kaaiman was responsible for the drownings that had occurred in the area over the years.